Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. What would you do if you found out that your ancestors were heavily involved in the American slave trade? What can you really do now anyway? Today we'll be talking with two women who wouldn't let those questions remain unanswered. Hear what they did about it today on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guests today are Katrina Browne, producer, writer, and director of the documentary Traces of the Trade, A Story from the Deep North, which premiered at the 2008 Sundance Film Festival, and her co-producer Juanita Brown, no relation, who served as a facilitator during some of the family discussions in the film. Together they designed the journey to retrace the triangle trade. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Your film, in addition to being featured at Sundance, has also been showing on the PBS series POV, or Point of View. Is there anything you'd like to say to set us up before we look at a clip from that film?
Well, the film was prompted by my discovering that my ancestors were the largest slave trading family in U.S. history, which I found out from my grandmother when I was 28 years old, and the layers of kind of shock and discovery around that, and particularly discovery that this wasn't just my family, that the North was massively complicit in slavery, contrary to what most of us get taught in school, is what prompted me to think this was something worth both delving into and sharing with the public.
Okay, let's watch.
She also explained that the first DeWolf, Mark Anthony, came to Bristol as a sailor in 1744. And then she wrote, "I haven't stomach enough to describe the ensuing slave trade." What hit me hard was the realization that I already knew this. Knew, but somehow buried it along the way.
We heard that word. I heard that word. And I still didn't think, slave trading.
Well, if there was a sign coming into town that said, "You're entering Bristol, the historic center of U.S. slave trading," things would be very different.
What I'm hoping that you have been hearing is every single black person that's talked to us has said exactly that. You white people need to talk to white people. That's what they've said.
I want to know what you mean by self-indulgent.
Oh, great.
What do you mean by that?
Absolutely.
Because, yeah.
Can
you be a little
I'm
briefer
worried
and
about
explain
a
that?
bunch of white people thinking very hard about their ancestors and what the slave trade meant to them, and the danger that in isolation we can start trying to assuage our sense of guilt and shame because we've decided we've dealt with it and feel better about it, rather than dealing with the consequences, the living consequences today.
The goddess of this river carry downstream all of our sorrows, all of our pain, all of our madness, all those insanities we collected during that period of time.
If you grew up where I grew up, you'd be pissed off. You know, anybody who's alive, you know, or who's paying attention should be pissed off. You know, and the fact that white people are not pissed off means that they're not paying attention.
I'm having a real problem with, I don't know what to call it, the itinerary. How it's feeling right now is that it's going to show up as a really neat travelogue about slavery. But damn, a lot is going on between us, and we're just being our nice Protestant selves, and I'm sick of it.
Once you really start to face the history and open your heart, now that I've done that,
I can say it actually becomes very natural to want to make things right, not out of personal guilt, but out of grief.
There's a lot of raw, honest emotion in the conversations that show on the film. That was a group of relatives, some of whom had never met each other, who went on the journey with you two. Was it hard to get those conversations started?
It wasn't. And the fact that they had self-selected and said, we want to go on this journey, we know what we're in for. The letter of invitation that they received said, if you want to go on this journey, be ready to make a fool of yourself, hopefully in front of millions of people.
Wow, okay.
So these were people who were ready and pretty courageous. And so we started in Rhode Island with conversations that were really about getting to know their particular backgrounds and histories and how it related to their knowing or not knowing about their connection to the slave trade. And from there it was up and down and in and out and around, but always heated and never a dull moment.
I'm sure. Katrina, did you find that most of these relatives had some of the same motivations that you had for wanting to be part of this project, or was there a variety of impulses driving their choices to participate?
There was some variety. There were, I had written to about 200 relatives, and of the 200, nine
chose to come along.
Chose to come, and for example, the question of guilt, which is a big one on this subject matter. So you had some of us, including myself, who couldn't help but be overwhelmed with a certain level of guilt, even if I knew I hadn't done it. There was still a sense of responsibility and upset and all of that, and others who were decidedly not feeling guilty and were really clear about that, and had. But I think all of us had a sense of there's something here that will give us more clues about ourselves and about black-white relations in America today and the sort of unfinished business of it all, so that, it's clearly there's still issues in this country, even if you, disagree on what to do about them or whatever. It was like we all agreed on that, and we hoped that this would help us understand better and understand what our role was in addressing that.
Right. Juanita, how did you get involved with this project?
I met Katrina in 1999 in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we were part of a creative and artist group. And being a part of that group meant that you were telling stories about yourself, improvisational stories, and so we got to know each other's stories. And around this time, Katrina was finishing up divinity school, and I was doing a lot of dialogue facilitation around race and class. And she told me about the project, and when all was said and done, we decided we were going to work together to make it happen.
You, Katrina, prepared for this project for a long time, right?
I was in seminary when I got the booklet from my grandmother, and it was a great time to receive it because I could absorb and take it in and start reading more and processing the layers of upset that came with each new thing that I read. So, discovering, for example, I assumed that that the DeWolfs must have been the only slave traders in New England because of how the textbooks tell it for most of us.
New England has some slave traders.
And so come to find out that Rhode Island, for example, was the state that sent the most ships to Africa. So it was basically the leading slave trading state in the whole country.
And slavery was legal in the North for 200 years, but this is later, most of it, right?
The abolition of slavery in the North is a really complicated story because every state abolishes it at a different time, and they do so very gradually. So they say things like, anyone born after this date won't be free until they're 18 or 25. So contrary to popular myth, I mean, most people don't think there was slavery in the North, but if you knew there was, you think it ended really early, but a lot of it persisted into the 19th century, even close to New Jersey, close to the Civil War. But the slave trade was abolished in 1808 nationally. But the economy of the North was completely tied into slavery even after slavery and the slave trade were abolished.
Talk to me about the triangle trade. Explain that to us.
So it was mostly northern ships and mostly Rhode Island ships that would go to West Africa. Rum was a really prime commodity of what they brought over to be traded for human beings, but all sorts of commodities were brought. Enslaved people, captured Africans were then brought, obviously, throughout the Americas. The Caribbean was a major destination. Cuba, for my family, Cuba in particular was one of their most frequent ports that they came to, Cuba and Charleston, South Carolina. So people were sold at auction. And in the case of the DeWolfs, they took it a step further. They decided to buy their own plantations in Cuba. So they had sugar and coffee plantations that allowed them to basically bring then molasses to the rum distilleries in Rhode Island. So you can see that they had this triangle, and they created their own bank, their own insurance company. You know, it just kind of went on and on and on. So it was a 3-generation dynasty revolving around a trade in human beings.
Juanita, what were you expecting as you embarked on this? I mean, how did you imagine your role would unfold, and had there been surprises for you in how all this came into play?
I had lived in Ghana in 1996 for a year, and so going back to Ghana in 2001 on this journey was very different, you know, because of the nature of the film and the nature of the project. And so I knew it was going to be a roller coaster ride for everyone. Sure. Because, I mean, just going to the places that we were going, we go to the slave dungeons, we go into the slave forts, and just really tracing that history and making it come alive, I knew would be really difficult. And it's not every day that a black woman goes on a journey with the descendants of the largest slave trading family in U.S. history. So I was expecting for it to be difficult, but I had prepared myself, and I wouldn't have been able to do this if I hadn't really felt like I had a spaciousness of spirit.
Wow,
and so,
yeah.
And we talked a lot. Katrina and I really worked together, not just on the logistics and on the content and the framework of what the trip should be, but also what's the spiritual arc here? What's the heart of this story? And so because we had that, and because we had to have a lot of conversations between us, hard conversations about what it means for me to be a working class, raised working class woman of African descent, and for her to be an raised owning class white woman with this legacy, what were the things that we were going to run into? And we had to be utterly honest with each other and transparent, or it wouldn't be authentic.
So you had this at a personal level, and then at the much broader implications for society in general. Is there a lot still unresolved for each of you?
For me, there's always a question of how do we really get underneath this? Mm-hmm. What is it going to take for this country to really reconcile its past? And the past is very much present in the future. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we learned is how the system of slavery and enslavement, even though it ended, the racism and the negative perceptions toward black people and other people of color shape-shifted over time. Sure. And found its way into legislation, found its way into the institutions that we know today, in business. And how do we reconcile that? Because when you look at different groups and their life chances, they're very different. Right. You know? And so racism and slavery impacted and damaged white Americans deeply. I mean, if you think about just the hard impact of that, it's quite damaging psychologically and spiritually.
Will you pick up on that? Yeah.
Sure. The word dissociation comes to mind. So, you know, this whole journey has given me, as you can imagine, so much food for thought. And so one strand of it is, at the time, white Americans at all class levels, so not just slave owners and slave traders, but you know, people who were working in the factories using Southern cotton, they were struggling, they were poor, they had horrible factory conditions. But there's a way in which I think you have to confront the fact that for white Americans, you're dissociating, as in you're ignoring the pain that's being experienced by people of African descent. You're sort of cutting yourself off from that. And that, I think, does pass on through the generations, so that there's a lack of empathy, I think. And so many white Americans, you know, we've screened the film all over the country, and so I hear again and again, you know, it's as if white Americans say, like, well, we know it was bad, of course it was bad, but that was a long time ago, and my people weren't part of it, or we came after slavery. So what does it have to do with me? So there's an interesting way in which I think underlying all of that is a desire to say, don't paint me with, don't give me any guilt, don't make me feel bad. I wasn't part of that, as opposed to where I've moved to is a place of, I have a strong connection to it, but I've still been able to move to a place of saying, I don't need to take it personally as if anyone's saying I'm bad, but I do need to notice how I've benefited from this, and why not have a huge degree of empathy towards what people of African descent have been through in this country. And it was just sort of like this, epiphany to realize I've shut off myself from that basic empathy because I feel so defensive, because I feel accused.
Well, I feel so helpless. If I let myself, it's not a callousness, it's a self-protection mechanism that if I let myself admit that my family has been complicit in horrible, horrible actions, I can't go back and change the past. I can't undo what's being done, what's been done. So I don't know how to fix the present or the future. And yet, you're already alluding to empathy as a starting point. What do we need beyond empathy?
Well, I think about, let's say you've done something wrong to your sweetheart, right? And you sort of continue on and you don't acknowledge it. Well, over time, it's going to build up resentment. And at some point, even thinking about my brother, who I love dearly, I did something that hurt him recently. And I kept doing it. Actually, I was doing it for a long time. And then he finally said, stop it. And I hadn't heard him until just recently. And I realized how much I had been hurting him. And in that moment, I finally got it. And I thought, and my heart broke. And I said, I'm so sorry. And he said, I don't need your apology. And I said, well, you can't tell me whether or not to apologize. He said, just make it right. And I think that I realized I could let my heart break in that moment, which was important for me to feel him and connect to him. And then the only way I could really show him that I was doing right by him and that I was really sorry is that I was going to be consistently different from then on.
One of your relatives in the film, Katrina, says they keep telling us to talk to white people. They keep saying white people need to talk to white people. Can one of you explain the context of that statement?
Yeah, well, and building off of what you were saying, Juanita, too, I think for a lot of white Americans, there's a sense of, well, I didn't do it. Or my people didn't do it. And what we learned in this process really complicated that picture of my people didn't do it, because the complicity ran the gamut from the extreme slave traders, slave owners, to even consumers. So if you were buying sugar or cotton clothes, you were complicit in the system. So it is a little more complicated in terms of one's ancestors, and including immigrants who come after, who kind of arrive in a country that's set up for them to be able to move ahead. The land of opportunity, this booming economy, white European immigrants were able to move ahead faster than Black Americans. So that's, the past is more complicated, and then in the present, this sort of feeling of like, I didn't do it, why do I have to apologize? I didn't do it. I think it's that stopping and pausing and realizing how your people have been hurt, not only by slavery, but by the incredible shape-shifting kind of aftermath of segregation and discrimination. It's like, once my heart is open to what's been endured, then I just noticed, as it said in the clip, it's just sort of natural to want to make things right, not out of personal guilt, but out of human to human, citizen to citizen, and it's a spiritual calling, a sense of just right and wrong. And so then the white people talk to white people part is, I just noticed how much stuff was in the way for me, and the more white people I began talking to about it, it's like, we have stuff, call it what you want, racial baggage, that gets in the way of our being able to be part of that conversation. And I was definitely hearing loud and clear from people of color that, we're kind of tired of holding your hand through the emotional process that you need to go through.
So go talk to each other.
So go talk to each other, hold each other's hand, and work through it, and then come back and we'll figure out how to solve the actual tangible problems that are much more public policy problems, much more like...
What are we all doing now that we all don't see as a problem that in 100 or 150 years we're going to look back and say, how could our ancestors have allowed that to happen?
I'm thinking domestically and internationally, and just domestically, when you brought that up, the first thing I thought was education. You know, just the disparity in educational outcomes and quality of education and educational opportunities, depending on where you live, depending on your zip code.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Depending on your parents' educational level. I believe that the education problem would be solved if every American went from their children and to our children.
Yeah.
And so until that happens, and that's the separation, you know, that we're talking about. And in any, if you think about any aspect, if you think about housing, if you think about healthcare, if you went from those people to they are my people.
So some audiences want to address the history that involves Africans selling other Africans into slavery. How do you respond to that piece of the history?
Yeah, that's actually a really important question. It comes up a lot in our screenings, and an important distinction to make right from the start is that Africans weren't selling their own people, because Africa is a big continent, and obviously there were lots of tribes and nations and kingdoms, so one tribe was, you know, if they were at war with another, then they had prisoners of war, and those frequently were the people who were being sold. It's also important to notice, though, that the slavery in Africa was really different. So what Europeans did was on a level and a magnitude that was unprecedented. So this sort of forced migration of millions of people and the erasure of culture and language and religion of African people was extreme.
It's almost like we industrialized the concept of slavery.
Yeah, you know, so to give those, to give more of an ear and a sort of kind, open-hearted ear to when African Americans are saying, quit deflecting, you know, you have to pay attention to the extreme nature of what happened to us. And that doesn't mean that black people weren't part of it over there, but so I think we all have work to do to kind of deal with all that gets stirred up in us when we're dealing with this subject.
One of the things that always comes up if you talk about what to do with the past and the present is the issue of reparations, and people get a little opinionated when we start to talk about reparations,
Yes.
defensive and angry. So what advice can each of you give us about how to think about that word and that concept?
If you look at the root of reparations, it's repair, right? And you said that. And so it's about understanding that something got broken. And the way we put this country together was in a broken way in a lot of ways. And how do we make that right? How do we hold on to the best of who we are? And then how do we sort of get to where we want to be as a nation that prides itself on democratic ideals, right? And so what I've found is that, you know, people sort of get a little, like you said, get a little tense and get a little glazed over when they hear that word. And part of it is because we don't know what it is that got broken, and we don't know that it's still broken. And that, again, the harm that was done originally, and is not just to, you know, people of African descent, but Indian people as well, is that it exists today in different forms. And until we can figure that, until people get that connection and stop thinking of history as a series of stops and starts, well, this law passed, so that means that, you know, when segregation ended, that meant that people were okay.
We've already fixed that.
We fixed it. Yeah. And people attitudes don't change just when the laws change.
In the spiritual sense, for those who draw on faith traditions, Christian tradition, for example, the idea of first acknowledgement and telling the truth, so the importance of telling the truth about the history, the truth shall set you free. And then repentance, which is, you know, a turning around, so sort of a change of heart and saying, oh, maybe I need to see the world differently than I have been seeing it. And then apology, and then atonement, making, you know, your brother saying, like, are you going to act different now? So atonement through action, and then that creates the potential for forgiveness. If you've asked for forgiveness and you've changed your behavior, then the potential for forgiveness arises, and then of reconciliation. But it's a process, and it needs to be, like, I love the model of restorative justice, because that's very much about those who've been hurt and those who've done the harm, or in this case, you know, just Actually, I don't even want to say descendants because people then think it's just for you to deal with, Katrina, leave the rest of us alone. We're all descendants of, yeah, and we're all inheritors. None of us today created slavery and its aftermath, but the shape-shifting means that there are forms of it now that are still unaddressed. But in any case, to have it be a relationship, and there's a great story of, at a screening that we did, it was an Episcopal diocese, and a white Episcopalian woman said, "I'd love to ask the black Episcopalians here what their definition of reparations is." And the first person who came up to the microphone was an elderly black woman, and she said, "Thank you for asking, because there are as many different definitions of reparations as there are black Americans. And mine is," and she answered for herself, and then beautifully one person after another came up and gave totally different definitions. And it was a great reminder that it needs to be a dialogue and a process rather than in the media when it gets portrayed. It's usually like, it's just about checks to individuals and that's crazy. And you know, people think it's one thing and it's an easy thing to fight over. What about making it a really heart-to-heart dialogue about what is broken and what needs to be repaired?
Thank you so much for the film and for our conversation. My guests today have been Katrina Browne, producer, writer, and director of the documentary Traces of the Trade, and her co-producer Juanita Brown. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.